Hi friends and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going through every single Oracle deck that I own. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the cards for each and every deck, talk to you a little bit about the cards and what I think of them. I'll be making a tarot edition of this video soon, so if you're interested in that, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when I upload that one. But let's not make this intro any longer than it needs to be. Let's get stuck straight into the cards. So let's start with the Life Design cards by McLoughlin. Now these are one of my favourite decks. It's quite unusual, to be honest. It has sort of different suits is the best way I can describe it, different sets of cards within the deck. The artwork I think is just beautiful, and the deck is kind of based on the principles of permaculture, which gives it sort of like an interesting perspective. And I do think that these card titles are some of the most unique that I've ever seen in an Oracle deck. I think it gives you a lot to go off intuitively that we don't always see in other types of Oracle decks. But it does also come with a great little white book that does sort of help you get a sense of the purpose of the deck and also provides some keywords and suggested meanings as well to get you going. And overall, I adore the artwork. I love the colours. Colours and artwork is something that is quite important to me in Oracle decks. I think that's not, it's fairly common for people. I love that there's a unique take on what an Oracle deck can do and what it can be. I love the sort of nature emphasis as well, even if permaculture isn't a thing that I'm super into or knowledgeable about. Nature is certainly very prevalent in these cards. There's also a bit of astrological association stuff going on, although again, it's not something I know a lot about. It's not something you need to know a lot about in order to enjoy this deck, I don't think. Ultimately, if you enjoy the artwork, I couldn't recommend this deck more highly. It's just such a wonderful deck and I've had so much fun with it. It's always really on point for me and I just get so much out of my relationship with these cards. From a deck that I love to a deck that I've never really used and I don't really understand is the Juicy Living cards by Sark. These cards are interesting. Their backings are all different, so it's kind of like an oracle on both sides of the card, so it's going to be sort of tricky for me to show you. But this is a deck that I saw on a Buy Swell Swap group one time and I thought it looked interesting, and that was like 2 years ago and I've never used it. Please don't judge me too harshly. But yeah, I don't know. It looks sort of fun and playful and interesting, but I don't have a lot to say about it because, like I said, I haven't really used it. I think the colours are fun and it seems like an interesting, quirky sort of deck. But it's definitely much more like affirmation based, I suppose. Which nothing wrong with, but not necessarily something I reach for a lot, I suppose. This is another deck I haven't really used a whole lot. It's the Star Student Astrology deck. I think this one comes on one of those print-on-demand websites. And again, it's sort of got stuff on the back of each card. In this case, we have sort of the meanings of the cards, I suppose. And I got this when I sort of decided that I wanted to learn more about astrology, and then I don't know, the pandemic happened and then any goals I thought I had for 2020 totally went out the window. So it has all the houses and then the signs. To me, I don't love this artwork. I know some people do and that's cool. It's very intentional. As we can see, the colours that have been chosen are very specific and there's lots of information. So I bought it more as like a learning tool as opposed to like an oracle deck that I liked the look of, if that makes sense. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but just personal taste. Not really for me. So I haven't really spent much time at all with this. In theory, I still like the idea of learning a bit more about astrology, but I'm not sure if I'm really in that place at the moment. So yeah, interesting deck. Just trying to show you some of the different things that are in the deck. There's lots of different elements of astrology, not just like the signs or whatever. This deck I've actually done a full review of, so I'll leave a link to that somewhere below. It's the Awakened Soul Oracle by Ethony. Ethony sent this to me when she first released it for review, which I did. But it's a deck that stayed with me. I've always really liked this deck. I think it's really gentle and encouraging and sweet. And then I've also sort of, like my mum and I share this deck. So it'll live with her for a little while and then it will live with me for a little while. So yeah, I really like this deck. I think it's great. The little white book or the guidebook is wonderful and gives you lots of different ways of looking at the card and lots of different things to think about. Even gives you sort of like affirmations and then actions for the day and stuff. So I think it's quite a proactive, positive sort of approach to Oracle, which I think is great. I also think the artwork's quite lovely. It's very, very colourful. Aims to depict sort of like the contemporary world, I suppose, as opposed to some of the other decks, which can be a bit more fantasy or historical-esque. This is definitely like, you know, witchy goodness and magic in our world today. So with this one, we get a keyword. Some of the sort of, you know, well-used and solid keywords that we see in a lot of Oracle decks. There are also some more unique ones as well. It's just a really like sort of balanced, cohesive deck that works really well. I also quite like it as a supportive oracle in tarot readings. It like works quite well with a lot of decks. And then it's also just great for like a one card draw at the beginning of the day, especially because it gives you some specific like actions to take or things to focus on. It's a great card of the day sort of a deck as well. This is a little Ogham oracle set that Danny Lang kindly sent me as a gift back a couple of years ago when I was sort of expressing an interest in druidry and then also potentially of learning Ogham, which is kind of not essential, I don't think, to every druid's practice, but it is kind of a core element and a big part of divination for a lot of druids. Again, this is another thing that I had intended to sort of get into in 2020, and then the world turned upside down and I didn't. But I feel more attached to this and continuing with this at some point and with druidry than I do with astrology. So I don't really have any intention of moving this deck along. I'm not sure, but I think this is something that I'd like to come back to at some point. It's just a simple little deck. Gives us a couple of keywords for each of the Oghams. Yeah, so I don't know that it's really standalone. You do get like this little pamphlet guide, but I think it is something that you'd need a book for, which I also do have. So I'm ready to go when I get around to it, basically. Yeah, sweet little deck. This next deck is the Aboriginal Spirit Oracles by Mel Brown. There's been a few different editions of this deck over the years. This is my second of the decks. I think I had the first edition, which also had a wooden box, but it was slightly different. And I think now you can get this deck in more like the classic cardboard box available at like shops and stuff. So it's an interesting little deck that sort of combines Mel Brown's approach to Aboriginal spirituality with sort of like goddess worship as it's like imagined in like some more European traditions. So we see sort of like some chakra imagery as well. So it's sort of like an amalgamation of a few different things. This was one of my first ever oracle decks. I found it at a little witchy shop, I suppose, in Bateman's Bay years and years and years ago. So this I don't really use anymore, but I do have like a lot of sentimental, like emotional attachment to it because it was sort of my first foray, or one of my first forays into oracles and into cards in general. It's really quite pretty, lots of colours. Yeah, and I really like the cards, like the size of the cards and stuff. And again, we just have like a keyword. I do think we have some interesting ones though, like we just had Saboteur, we got Self-Respect. So balance is a more like one that we see in a lot of oracles. That's not a criticism at all, just a statement. Creativity. Whereas some we get are a little bit more unique to this deck or just ones that I don't see all the time. So it's an interesting little deck. Next we have the Flowers of Night Oracle by Cheralyn Darcey. I have another Cheralyn Darcey deck that we'll be talking about soon. This one was originally printed, I think it was a limited edition of 200 and supported through Kickstarter. And then Rockpool did pick it up. Rockpool's printed a few of Cheralyn's other decks, but they were a bit slow to jump onto this one. So there is a newer version of this deck, and I have done like a comparison of the indie version and the then new Rockpool one. I don't know if they've made further changes in the years since, but a couple of cards have changed, but overall, like, the look of the art is still, you know, it's still here. This is just a beautiful deck. It's, you know, Cheralyn's sort of lino print artwork that fans of hers will know and love. But it's a focus on, obviously, the nighttime. And then we also sort of have like an animal companion to each of the cards as well. Or she'll reference like the star or something else in the guidebook as well. So I suppose it's what people would call like a shadowy sort of deck. It definitely takes a look at like more our subconscious and our internal world. It invites us to reflect in that way. And the guidebook's, you know, pretty good at helping you sort of get started in that journey. This isn't a deck I use a whole lot at the moment, although I have had some pretty powerful and impactful readings with it over time and when I do go to it. So it's an interesting deck and one that I really quite appreciate. I think it's really beautiful. And I'm like a big fan of Cheralyn's artwork. I think it's wonderful. Also, this backing, I've said before, I'll say it again, it's probably my favourite Oracle backing ever. I think it's beautiful. Next up, we have the Amethyst Oracle by Jessica Bott. This is sort of the companion oracle, I guess, to the wonderful Idiosyncratic Tarot, however you say it, which is a tarot deck that I absolutely love. And so in theory, I should enjoy this oracle deck a lot more than I do, but I don't really find that I go to it a whole lot. So it is a deck that I want to sort of experiment and play around with a bit more, but I have been saying that for years, to be fair. This one is quite playful and fun. It's got some unique cards, which I think is really cool. I love this card. I really love the imagery in this deck and in the Idiosyncratic Tarot too. I really enjoy the art. I think it's really fun. It's really playful, so colourful and vibrant, but quite simplistic too, so it's just really easy to see. There is no little white book that comes with this deck. I'm not sure if there's more info online about the cards, but it really is just a sort of, you get the cards and you figure out your own path with them, I suppose. I quite like how we have like day, night and like season cards and stuff. I think it's really cool. I definitely think there's some unique cards in here, which, I mean, sort of makes me like this deck a lot more, even if I haven't really spent a lot of time with it. Got the elements here too. I think that's such a pretty depiction of air. Precarious. I don't know, like, I just feel like Jessica's managed to convey such like a strong feeling and such like a powerful sense of each of the cards. Like, it's so simplistic, but you really just like get it immediately looking at it. I think she's done it really well. Well, Oracle de Miroirs, I don't know how to pronounce this properly. This is a cute little deck that, again, has another one of my favourite backings. I think it's really cool. The art's really colourful, really fun. This is a French deck that my mum picked up for me as a gift when she and my dad, I think it was like one of their anniversaries, went to Paris for a little holiday. And yeah, she picked me this deck. And Mum and I played around with it a little bit together, which was fun. And you can like pretty well work out the keywords for most of these, even if you don't speak French like me. But I haven't used it a lot. And it's sort of a deck that I'm just okay with having in my collection, even though I don't use it. I don't tend to feel that way about a lot of decks. But this one just really feels like quite a special thing that Mum got me. So yeah, I've kept it all these years, mostly for that reason. And I think it's really cool. It's really pretty. It's quite interesting. And that backing, I think, is beautiful. There is a little white book with this one, but it's in French, so not much use to me. But if you speak French, I don't know, maybe you'll enjoy this deck a little bit more or get more use out of it. Because I enjoy it, I just don't get a lot of use out of it. And that's okay, I don't mind. I have different decks in my collection for different reasons, and this one is here for sentimental value. This little oracle deck is a very special one. This one was sent to me as a gift by the one and only Veronica Jude. Thank you, Veronica. I still can't get over how generous that was. The Fantastic Menagerie is one of my favourite tarot decks that I've had for a long time. It's back in print now, which is exciting. But I always had wanted this oracle deck because it's sort of the companion deck from Bubba Studios. It features JJ Granville's artwork. Bubba Studios has sort of like played around with them a little bit, and then we've got like the name of the card and some keywords. So even though it's the companion deck for the Fantastic Menagerie and I have used them together, I also really enjoy this Oracle deck on its own. It is an Oracle deck though that I found, I mean, you can do 1-card spreads, you can do whatever you want with any deck. But I have found that I really quite enjoy doing 3 to 5 card spreads with this deck, which is not a super common thing for me with Oracle. I tend to be more of a 1-card pull sort of girl for Oracle decks. So this one I use a little bit differently. It has a little bit more of like that more divinatory, like fortune telly vibe to it. I don't want to say it's like a Lenormand deck because I don't use Lenormand, but it's got a little bit more of that edge, I think, than some of these more like, you know, flower cards and stuff. So I think it fits nicely in my collection as something a little bit different, but also that kind of goes along with a tarot deck that I already love so much. Now my Cups of Contemplation cards from Juli from Peekaboo Rose. This is quite an affordable little deck that you can get on a print-on-demand website again. And it's a deck that Juli created herself. And we have these really cute, all different mugs and cups of tea or coffee. I think of them as tea. With just like a thoughtful, gentle oftentimes, but also there's a lot of potential with these questions, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. So they're great for, I have seen people sort of draw one of these cards and then use another tarot or oracle and sort of use this question as like their spread position and then another oracle from a different deck to answer this question. I did also talk about this deck recently in my therapeutic deck video where I spoke a little bit more about some of the ways that I use this deck and how I've just found it really helpful for reflecting on sort of like where I'm at and what I'm prioritizing, what's important to me, making sure that I'm kind of connected to what's important to me. So this is a great little deck, a little bit different from other Oracle decks in the sense that, you know, we're being asked a question instead of being provided an answer. So a very reflective one. I think it's also great if you're a journaler. These can be great journaling prompts too. The Elements of Recovery cards by Beverly King is another deck I spoke about in that video about my therapeutic decks. This deck is based specifically on the principles and teachings of the 12 Steps program that's sort of well known through Alcoholics Anonymous. So it's a deck all about abuse, like substance abuse, addiction, and recovery. I do think though, as I've said before, that this can be a useful deck for things other than just like literally substance abuse, although that's sort of like where this deck is coming from. I think it's also great for using to get to the bottom of other sort of compulsive and like addictive tendencies that we can develop, or, you know, like unhealthy maladaptive coping strategies and behaviors and habits that we can develop. So essentially it's the 12 steps and all of the different ideas and principles within that framework, just without the sort of like dogmatic language and the very Christian language, which I really appreciate. I found this deck really, really helpful for me in my substance abuse recovery, but also just with other things like my perfectionism, for example. I just think it's wonderful. It's a sweet little deck and just like a great resource that I think Beverly King's given us, and I love it. Next up is the Flowers of Love cards. This is another deck that my mum picked up for me on one of her trips, mostly because the box has sunflower on the front and she thought it was sweet, and I love sunflowers. This has become one of my like favorite Oracle decks that I've had, and I've had it for such a long time. It's really quite unique and interesting too, because again, this is one of those Oracle decks that sort of does have a structure to it and does have what I would call suits, I suppose. The different coloured borders here denote the different suits, I guess, and they're called in the guidebook different stages of love. Each of these cards is connected to a myth or a folktale, and in the guidebook they sort of detail the element of the folktale that can, I don't know, give us a little message about the different stages of love and relationships. So for such a little deck and for such a simple looking deck, there's actually quite a lot going on. Like we get the myths and the folktales, we also get this interesting structure, the different stages like of progression that love can take. It's really interesting. There's a lot to it, a lot more than might first meet the eye. And also it's just really cute. It's one of those decks that I think goes great with tarot decks to sort of round out a reading. But it's also a deck that I think works really well on its own. And I really like it. I've had some great readings with it. I once used this as like a oracle deck for my Wheel of the Year spread that I did. Like I had a card and this oracle deck for each month of the year. And that went really well. It sort of like provided an interesting sort of spin on the tarot for each month of the year. It's just a really sweet little deck, and the guidebook is really, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. It gives you quite a lot of information about each of the folk tales and also like interpretations as well. So I think it's pretty accessible if you haven't used Oracle a lot and you want to sort of experiment with something more than just like affirmation style decks or decks that you pull one card from for the day. Like this has a bit more to it, but still like a lot of, it provides a lot of help for you as well. And also it's just really fun and sweet and cute, and I really love it. Now the Dreamtime reading cards by Laura Bowen. These were kind of like my first love as far as Oracle's concerned. I think this was like the first or maybe the second deck review I did on my channel, like literally in like 2015 or something. So like if you want to see more of the cards, feel free to go look at that, but also please don't, because it's kind of really cringy on my end. Maybe I should do an updated review that I actually feel comfortable linking to. Anyway, this deck is just wonderful. Laura Bowen is an incredible artist. Her guidebooks are so thorough and interesting while still being fairly like concise. You don't get overwhelmed with information, but you get more than enough to go off. She is an Aboriginal artist who lives on the coast of New South Wales, and she uses feathers to create her artwork, and it's just beautiful. I love her art. Laura also does a lot of courses about connecting with nature in respectful ways, and also teaching how to create your own oracle deck if that's stuff you're interested in. Laura just, not only has she given us some of the best oracle decks I think we have on the market, she also just provides a lot of really cool resources. So if you're not following her, I definitely recommend that you do. And the Dreamtime reading cards will forever and always be one of my favorite decks, one of those decks that's just really close to my heart because I think it's wonderful. It's a really earthy and fiery deck in my view. I just think it's really well-rounded and holistic. I think it just gives such wonderful readings, whether you're going for that one card draw or you want to do like a 3-card spread or even more. I tend to either do 1 card or 3 cards. Either way, I'm never disappointed by these cards. They're just beautiful. And the messages are always really helpful, but never sugar-coated. Like it's a really well-balanced deck for me. I love it. And while I'm raving about Laura Bowen, let's keep going and talk about her Saltwater reading cards. I never thought I would love a deck more than I love the Dreamtime reading cards. And then Laura Bowen sent me this deck. And I loved it straight away, but it sort of took me a couple of years to appreciate just how good this deck is. I think because I was still just so into the Dreamtime reading cards that it took me a little while to sort of spend a good amount of time with this deck when I was always just going to the Dreamtime reading cards. This has become one of those decks that I take with me when I go on trips, especially with my mum, especially if I'm going somewhere, like Bateman's Bay, on the ocean, but really anytime. And it's also become a deck that's very healing for me. I think when you think of Saltwater, it's quite harsh, but it's also just so cleansing. And I think that feeling really comes across in these cards. Sometimes it's soothing and nurturing, and other times it's really quite, salt in the wound, but you need it. And oh my God, I can't get over how beautiful these cards are. I love the greens and the blues and even the purples, and I just think it's just incredible, this deck. I recently took it to Bateman's Bay with my mum, and we drew a card every day each, and honestly it kind of got us through. I'm not even kidding. Cards like this would come up for us all the time and just really help us refocus on like what we needed to do to take care of ourselves to get us through a difficult time. So this deck feels fresh and vibrant and alive, but it also just sort of really gets into where you need it to and calls you out when you need it to. I don't know. It's just an incredible deck, and I will never stop raving about Laura's decks. I won't. I refuse. I know quite a few of my friends now, those all around the world have got this deck now and really enjoy it too. And it makes me smile whenever I see anyone else enjoying Laura's work, because I think it's fabulous. And I think this is probably definitely if I had to pick a favorite Oracle deck and the Oracle deck that I've used the most, this would be it. It's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Now, the Antiquities of Magick Oracle by Jillian C. Wilde. Jillian is a much beloved tarot and oracle deck creator in this community, and she did send me this oracle deck. I know her Naked Heart Tarot is like a favorite of many people, and I can see why, because the artwork is amazing. Here, though, we get a similar artwork, just sort of scaled back a little bit, and put into an oracle deck that is based on the symbolism that is found within tarot, which I think is a really cool sort of concept for an oracle deck. I really like the small size of the cards too, and as always, Jillian's artwork is just absolutely beautiful. I think it's wonderful. And I've had a lot of fun with this deck. I do think that this is a deck that I tend to prefer to use with other decks. So if I do a spread with tarot, this is a deck that I like to use as an additional. It does have more of that divinatory sort of like fortune telly vibe to it sometimes. I think just because we've got like some cards that sort of are reminiscent of more Lenormand style decks as opposed to some of the oracle decks we have. One thing my only complaint for me personally in how I use cards is that we have like the title here and then like the title in Latin. I would have preferred to have like a keyword or something instead of the title in Latin, because that just doesn't do a lot for me. But having said that, no keyword means you can sort of just like let your intuition do what it wants with the imagery, and what comes up for you instead of being boxed in by any preconceived notions, I suppose. The booklet, and it's not a little white book, it definitely is a booklet, is really great too. It's wonderful. There's heaps of info. We get a little bit of history about the symbol, so like how sunflowers have shown up in a culture, I suppose, throughout history, which I think is pretty cool. It's also got an oracle message, which is a couple of paragraphs sort of giving you an actual message for the day or for your reading. There's some keywords provided in the guidebook, which is great. And she also connects each card to tarot cards as well. So if you're a tarot reader, I think you'll really enjoy this oracle deck. And then there's also an incantation for each card, which is sort of like an affirmation attached to the imagery. So it's quite a unique deck in a lot of ways, like that connection to tarot and the symbols kind of pulled out of tarot imagery to create an oracle, I think is a really cool idea. And it's really well executed as well in terms of the way that Jillian's presented it, set it up, and also like written about it in the guidebook. It's a deck that provides something new, but also provides a lot of avenues into sort of understanding its purpose. I think it's been done really well. Here we have my second of Cheralyn Darcey's decks, and this is my personal favourite. It's the Australian Wildflower reading cards. I love this deck, and kind of like the Saltwater reading cards, this is a deck that I will often take with me, especially if Mum and I are going on a trip somewhere. I just think it's beautiful, and I love that it's Australian specific. She does also have the Wildflower reading cards, which come in a yellow box, which take inspiration from flowers all over the world. And they are fun because they also incorporate like actual landscapes and like different sort of monuments and things from around the world. So if you like this artwork and you like this deck, but you're not really keen on an Australian specific deck, definitely check that one out. However, if you are interested in an Australian specific deck, this is absolutely, you can't go past this one if you're interested in flowers. This deck is it's so beautiful, and I really quite liked Cheralyn's approach in the guidebook as well. Again, she gives you plenty of info without giving you too much, and I think it's just quite an accessible deck. And of course, Rockpool are one of my favourite publishing houses for cards. Their cards are really affordable for what you get. You get these big, beautiful boxes, big, beautiful, vibrant cards, and usually full colour guidebooks, or at the very least, still very thorough guidebooks. You get a lot for your money, basically. And yeah, I think these cards are beautiful, and they're some of my most used as well. Now, this is not a deck that I really think of as an oracle deck, but I still just thought I would include it so that I've covered all my bases. This is the ACT deck, which stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. This is a deck that basically just provides different practices and exercises that come from the therapy system of ACT. So I've spoken a little bit about this deck and how I use it in my recent video about therapeutic decks. So I'll leave a link to that below and in the cards, which you can check out if you'd like to know a little bit more about this. But yeah, I'm just including it for the sake of including all of the oracle decks I have. As I mentioned, this one is split into 3 different sections, engaged, aware, and open. So it's a great little deck if this is something that you're interested in. And then along the same vein, the Dialectical Behavioural Skills card deck. This is a card deck all about the different skills and practices within DBT. Again, I spoke about this one recently in that same video, so definitely check that out if these sort of things interest you. DBT is my favourite of the therapy systems. It's definitely the one that's helped me the most. And this deck is separated into the 4 different skill sets within DBT, which is distress tolerance, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, and mindfulness. I always forget one. I never forget the same one, but I always forget one. Anyway, these cards are wonderful. DBT is wonderful. And definitely check that video out. Alright, so that is every single oracle deck that I currently own that is currently in my possession. As I said, I will be doing a tarot version of this video. I might have to split it into 2 because I definitely have a lot more tarot than I do oracle. But I'll be aiming to get that up to you in the next few weeks. So if that's something you're interested in, don't forget to subscribe and hang around so that you'll get notified when that one goes up. But that's all from me for now, so thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. So much love. Bye!